Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. Join me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, for real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and masculine, you learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
Together, working at a practical level, you'll learn to trust that everything that is happening is for you, your growth, and ultimate freedom.
Our circumstances don't matter. It's only how we relate to them that does.
Get ready to befriend the wisdom of your body and the power of your mind.
Break Free and Trust starts now.
Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jacqueline. And on today's podcast, we're going to explore addiction and recovery from a really unique perspective. We're not here to teach you about research, nor are we here to proclaim that we're experts in the field, but rather we are going to share from our lived experience and hope that in so doing, something within you is moved. Now, I guess to get started, I don't know how many of you know what my history in the field of addiction and recovery is, so I'm just going to share briefly that I worked as a clinical counselor in a residential treatment facility for a number of years, doing both individual and group work in the field of addiction. And, little did I know that that work would actually create a context or a container for what would one day become my marriage. Because what that work gave me was as much of an understanding as somebody who is not suffering from addiction could have about addiction. And, fast forward a number of years, I met my husband, or I met you, Chris, in a yoga class. And at the time, you were in active addiction, but I had no idea. And fast forward another year and a half, I got to meet you as a colleague who was in recovery. And over time, really got to understand that your experience and history with addiction goes all the way back to childhood. Because you grew up in a house with an alcoholic mother, and over time, resisted the temptations of addiction for a long time until you succumbed, and through that process, blew up your entire life and really hurt the people that mattered most to you. Gave up your job and were brought down to your knees, having to really start over again. And I have watched you post that process as you've lived in the world of recovery. And I've watched you transform your experience into one of service, where you work with a number of people who are struggling with addiction, both as a coach and as a sponsor, and in some ways as a counselor. And not even just with the people struggling with addiction themselves, but also with their families. And I think you have a really unique perspective to bring to our listeners, particularly from the standpoint as somebody who has lived in the body of both the addict, let's say, and the family member of an addict. So I think I'm going to stop there and actually turn this over to you and ask you the question from your lived experience. What is addiction?
Oh boy, that's a big question. But before I go there, I want to reflect on some of the things you said. Yeah, in my own experience as like child of an alcoholic, cognizant of alcoholic and how it affected my whole side of my mother's family. Like absolutely everybody thought I was putting the mechanisms in place to not become an addict myself. The main thing I wanted to do in my life was not become an addict. Growing up in it, then succumbing to it, a full blown bottoming experience, and then moving into recovery, and then ultimately finding a path and career in helping people and families in addiction. So yeah, it's a very it almost feels like yeah, it's about time to have this conversation on this podcast, and I'm excited. And I just also want to reflect too, like when I re-met you and Jacqueline, when I was in recovery and I told my story, what the most amazing experience I had is I finally found someone I could tell the story to that wasn't full of judgment, and I didn't feel shame because Jacqueline had enough understanding of addiction to recognize the disease it was. And maybe that's a great place to start with. What is addiction? And I'm going to talk about what addiction is from my perspective, my lived experience. This isn't a textbook description of it. This is what I would sit down and talk to a family that wants to understand what's happening, or talk to someone who's wondering if they have some issues. The symptoms of addiction is first and foremost the physical craving. So we're going to use alcohol as the substance for the purpose of this conversation for right now. After the first drink, a physical phenomenon of craving kicks in for an alcoholic. So most people will have one or two, maybe three drinks, feel good, but that's enough. I don't need to have any more. For an addict, that just gets things going. Some craving kicks in that they'll keep drinking and drinking and drinking until there's no more. They black out. So there's that physical craving, and we've all seen that. The other symptom that's less understood, I'll call it the obsession of the mind. And that is when the alcoholic isn't drinking, they're probably thinking about drinking. And I can say this experience because in this whole period of time before I really succumbed to it, I'd have these rules like I wouldn't drink during the week, or I wouldn't drink in these particular periods of time. And if I'm honest and I look back at it, I was thinking about drinking the entire time. Monday morning, 9 o'clock at work, I'm thinking about when I'm going to have my first drink on the weekend. It's that obsession of the mind that just never stops with an addiction for whatever the substance is. And we're talking alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, sex, like the list goes on. Most of us will know somebody that has some addictive tendencies. Now, this is getting into some of the stuff that's, trying to create some understanding of the disease for people who haven't experienced it. It's a disease that convinces a sick person that they are not sick, nor should they seek help. And there's this saying we have is that the last person to know they're an alcoholic or addicted is the alcoholic or the addict. Everybody else has figured it out except this person. And in fact, it leads a sick person to lie, manipulate, cheat, control anything to prevent them from getting help or for people seeing their disease. And at the end, it leaves the alcoholic or the addict alone and isolated. And the contrast is something like, use another disease like cancer. Okay, there's a lump on my body. I immediately go to my doctor seeking treatment. I get a diagnosis. I immediately look for as much help as I can get. I bring in a support group. I do all these things because I want to get better. The response is the exact opposite with an alcoholic. They immediately move to hide it, deny it, push it away, and even tell themselves all these stories about how it's not true. And I would say more than anything, it's a form of insanity. So the mind of an addict in full addiction is completely insane. And if we think about the second step in the 12-step process, it is coming to believe that something can restore us to sanity. That's the second step. So there's this full admission, oh my gosh, I've gone into insanity.
Can you help me understand and actually, well, help our audience understand? What is it that drives the alcoholic to hide and to continue going down the road of insanity, as you call it, versus being able to ask for help?
Yeah. I mean, and that's the cunning, baffling, and powerful nature of the disease. And I don't know if there's an understanding of why, but I think when I really try to conceptualize addiction to people, I conceptualize it as a parasite. I'm going to tell you a story about this parasite it's called Toxoplasma gondii. Now, this is a pretty common parasite in most mammals, but it has this really unique feature to it. It can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a cat. Like I say that again, this parasite can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a cat. That sounds like an insane survival mechanism for anything. So how does it survive? What has it done to adapt? Well, what it's figured out is the parasite, when it's ready to sexually reproduce, will jump onto a rat. It will take over the neural functions of the rat and convince the rat that it likes cats and gets the rat to run directly into a cat to its death. And you watch these videos of rats that have this parasite, and there'll be a bunch of cats sitting around an alley, and this rat will come up to it, and they'll all sort of look at each other like what's going on here? And then they'll kill and eat the rat. That's how that's the best model um, example of addiction that I come across, and it's courtesy of a guy named Paul Hederman. And how I equate that is you can take 10,000 addicts and put them in 10,000 different cars in a parking lot, and they'll head off in 10,000 different directions. They'll all end up eventually in three locations: a jail, an institution, or death. And it's this what happens is happening is the survival need of the host gets overwritten by the survival need of the parasite. And in this case, it's addiction. And so the addiction is the parasite, and the survival needs of the human or the host gets overwritten to achieve that. And this literally will create a false reality in the person that suffers to justify the drinking. It literally, the person can't distinguish between true or false and even right or wrong anymore. And we watch it happen over and over again, where an addict or an alcoholic will literally burn their life to the ground before giving up their addiction. They'll sacrifice everything they love for that addiction. And what's the most interesting part about this is this: it's totally homogeneous. If you hear the stories of folks in the recovery room, they got different characteristics to it, but the context's all the same.
Well, that definitely sounds like insanity.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds, I mean, it sounds a lot like the way we would describe what happens when somebody's brainwashed.
Yeah.
And interesting how we can take a physical disease and meet it with compassion and kindness. But we take a mental health disease, which addiction is absolutely one of, and we meet it with tremendous amount of judgment and stigma. How do you think we can change
Hmm. That's the, I mean, that's the $1 million question. I mean, I hope part of what we're doing here is having this conversation with a wider audience outside of alcoholism and addiction. Is it starts to create that process where people begin to look at it like it's a disease. Um, but I think I would actually say, as someone who uh, when I recovered, I changed my career and moved into psychotherapy, coaching, spiritual teaching. And one of the things I recognized going through my whole psychology master's is the information that's taught on alcoholism and addiction. Although it's recognized as a disease, it's missing key features of what can help the addict or the families get healthy for that disease. It still focuses so much on this idea of willpower. If the addict just tries harder, or just has a different routine, or goes to the gym, or maybe has better nutrition, will stop drinking. And it's simply far more complex than that. What I found and what the literature talks about is a lot of the people that fall into addiction alcoholics, have extremely strong willpower, extremely good discipline, and they've actually used that in every aspect of their life and have actually come quite successful in many cases. And that's actually part of the problem, because when they start running into problems with drugs or drinking, they just assume that same willpower will work in helping them get over it. And I think that's what baffles and it doesn't. It has the exact opposite effect. It actually pushes them further into addiction, because it's almost a disease of the mind that you've thought your way into the problem. You're not going to think your way out. And I think that's why it gets so complicated for families, because they said, wait a minute, my dad is able to have a successful career, do all these things. He's super fit. If he wanted to stop drinking, he would choose to stop drinking. He just doesn't want to. must be a bad person. He must make bad moral choices. But that's not the truth of it all. It's like you said, it's like the host has been brainwashed. And there's this saying by this guy named Chuck C, who's wrote a book called A New Pair of Glasses. And I just happened to read this yesterday in our reading group. And he said this line: until my last drink, my drinking was always someone else's fault. And that's this brainwashing denial that the addict goes through.
And I think there's another piece too, which is really important to speak to, which is we speak about addiction as being a disease of the mind, but it's also a disease of the brain. And the dopamine, the way that dopamine works in the brain and our reward centers work is that, our addictions, whether they be alcohol, drugs, sex, porn, gambling, whatever, shopping, whatever they actually create a release of dopamine in the brain. And the brain's natural tendency is always towards homeostasis. So if the reward cycle says, ooh, I just got something really good that made me feel good, the other side of that scale is pain. And we're taught in our society to move away from anything that creates discomfort and to move towards something that feels pleasurable. But the challenge is that every time we feed our bodies dopamine extrinsically, so from the outside, what happens is that our pain response actually comes up to meet it, which then says, I need more. And then it comes up. And then I need even more. And so it's not just why can't you get your shit together and get over this the same way that you get over everything else or you manage to meet everything else. There's actually chemical changes that are happening in the brain of an addict that are really profound and require shifting in order for an addict to heal. And that's something that, the way in which we hold, if we were able to see or use a disease model around addiction, we could meet addiction with the same level of understanding and compassion that we could meet another physical disease. Except that, let's just use diabetes as an example. The person that's suffering from diabetes and has an insulin glucose challenge, while there's a disruption within their own physical body, that doesn't necessarily create havoc on the world around. It creates havoc on their lives. The addict inevitably leaves a world of disaster in his or her wake. And the impact that an addict has on a family system, as you know from your personal experience, is profound and incredibly painful. And in my work, I think one of the biggest questions that I really had was, get to see the people that are struggling with addiction come to terms with their addiction and begin to surrender, because most of them are brought to their knees, and begin to do a different kind of work and a new, well, in some ways, almost like a recreation of self from a different perspective. And begin to tap into joy and begin to tap into an expansive understanding of themselves in the world, spirituality, etc., which is really beautiful to watch. But then they go home, if they've left home, into a family system they've systematically destroyed. And you're sort of left in this place where families are sitting here with so many resentments and so much history, and an addict comes home ready to start life again, And I wonder, from your experience, both your own and as a sponsor and a coach, what your experience is with that.
Before I answer that question, I want to come back and address something you said earlier. Like um, when you made that analogy of like, I think it was diabetes and seeking help, and it doesn't cause carnage to the family unit. That's really profound because that's a main feature of addiction. Is they say on average, uh, an addict has a massive disrupting effect on a minimum of nine people in their life, and it's usually much more. And the immediate family members are directly affected. But there's also another really important feature. I just want to dwell on it because it's going to be important as we go into the family unit, is the addict's inability to see it, the inability to take responsibility for anything that's happening this entire time. And so again, it's just like you can think of a diabetes patient that's like on the verge of death that keeps denying they have diabetes, almost to the point of death. So you can imagine, so it's ruining everyone's life around them. It's going on, it's getting worse and worse. Yet the person that's suffering from the disease saying, I'm totally fine. It's all you. It's not me. And takes no responsibility for anything that's happening until the point they do. And that's the really interesting part of the disease.
So I have a question there, because I hear something that I think a lot of families would probably ask, which is, so you're telling me that as your, I'm going to use you as an analogy, but as you're drinking your face off, doing all kinds of terrible things, that you have absolutely no sense that you're doing anything wrong and having an impact on anybody?
You have, it's a great way to think. You have a sense, but then the justification process of the mind, the power of the mind takes over. It convinces you otherwise. I'm going to use a very graphic example here, and this is like, this will sound like an extremely shocking story from someone who doesn't understand addiction or alcoholism, but someone who's been through it will just say, oh yeah, I probably did that too. Back like in the height of my addiction, it's like I remember it's like 2 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night. I'm getting up for work at 5:30. And to me, it was a good idea to have a drug dealer drop off drugs in my mailbox. Meanwhile, my family's sleeping in the house. That's the kind of stuff that goes on day after day in the life of an addict who continually takes on a more richer and deeper secret life that's all revolves around this addiction that nobody's knowing about because they're hiding it. But for some reason, it all made sense to me at the time. Every aspect of it was justified, and nothing seemed that far out of the ordinary. And the limits that our mind of an addict will go to all make sense is what allows their whole life to burn down around them. And only in that moment where, okay, I don't have a family anymore, I don't have a job anymore, I don't have any friends anymore, I'm out of money and I'm on the verge of death, do they realize, oh wait, maybe I'm the problem, maybe it's me.
And what I find really interesting is that what I'm hearing you say in a lot of ways is that in the grips of addiction, an addict has an inability to be able to take any responsibility for their behavior. And yet, from what I know of you in recovery, the shift is one of moving into radical responsibility in order to recover and to heal.
Yeah, if when I was in the height of my addiction, if my lips were moving, I was lying to you. I was manipulating with you. I was trying to control something. I was self-centered, dishonest, and the recovery is like looking at that, taking responsibility for it, and then being the exact opposite of that, trying to be the exact opposite of that for the rest of your life because you saw where that took you.
And I think that's a really good place for us to take a break, because what I'd like to come back to is to actually speak about what recovery looks like. That sound okay?
That sounds great.
Okay. See you in a minute. Welcome back. So we left off with you sharing that moment in time where everything shifted for you. And I know that moment for a lot of people who have dealt with addiction is a moment of being brought to their knees. It's a rock bottom moment. And I know that that's true for you. Can you share what happened then?
Yeah, and by grace, I had found my way into a residential, I was willing finally to go to a residential treatment facility. My second one, the first time I hadn't accepted I had a problem. And so I couldn't hear any message. I was there for 30 days taking notes, but I couldn't hear anything. And then I couldn't hear anything for months after that. Things finally got bad enough that I was at a place where I could now hear the message. And I basically adopted a 12-step program. And I'm not going to go through all the steps, but it's sort of three chunks. One is just admit and the admission I'm powerless and I can't solve the problem on my own. My own thinking got me here, and my own thinking is not going to get me out. It's literally failed me in every aspect of my life by this point. So I'm gonna turn it over to something else, and I'm just going to call a higher power. But it's not me. It's just not me. The second part goes a lot into what you brought up earlier about these balances of pain and dopamine. It's okay. The pain is this aspect of the underlying cause. The addiction's the symptom. The pain is what's causing me to keep searching for dopamine. Let's take a look at what my character's like, what my fears are, what my resentments are, what my limiting beliefs are, to understand where is this pain coming from? What is the unresolved trauma in my life that I haven't looked at? And taking a deep look at that, and then trying to resolve that. And then from there, ultimately, try to continue to not let that build again, but go into service and continue to increase my conscious contact with my higher power. And it sounds very simple, and it is, and it's a lot of work, but that's ultimately the three main stages of recovery. And for those who've had successful recovery, it's often a massive change and a redesign of living, to move out of self-centeredness into selfless service for others, to move out of being directed by self-will, being directed by what I'll say is God's will, for lack of a better word, and moves us on to live this life of service.
So, as I'm sitting here listening to you, and I know how powerful all of this was for you and how much it means to you and in our life now. But there's something that sort of, you know, as as a listener and as if I was to put myself in the body of the person that I was before I met you, I would be like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And what I hear in some of what you're speaking, which you sort of jumped over a little bit, is that one of the biggest pieces of recovery is actually learning how to be with pain, learning how to be with discomfort, because now the part of you that wants to escape it knows that the only place that the escape is going to take you is into institution, death, or jail. And that's not an option anymore. So that whole wisdom of no escape that Pema Chodron speaks to is, oh wait, shit. Now I have to be with this. And it's in the being with it, connected to your connection to higher power and your capacity to enter into service, that healing happens. Does that resonate?
It does. And you can even think of the predicament even more dire than that, in the sense that, okay, I've come to this point in my knees where I know I need to change. I've used alcohol and drugs to cope my entire life. And now my life's just blown up, and the addict may have lost everything. So not only to have the previous pain, it's all the new pain, but no coping mechanisms to deal with. Like, where do we go?
Like, to put that into context for those of you that are listening that aren't actually struggling with addiction, this is the place that most of us find ourselves in. We're living in a society of instant gratification. And whether we see ourselves as addicts or we don't, our inability to be with discomfort is fueling all kinds of behaviors that are making us all really sick. And it's a practice. Like, Addiction is not something that I struggle with, but let me tell you, learning how to work with and be with myself when I feel discomfort is a daily practice. Okay, so where do you want to take us now?
Um, I just sorry, I just lost my. I was just had a thought. Let me come back to my train of thought here.
We were talking about discomfort.
Yeah, so this is it's coming back to me is that, and we talk about I'm a person in recovery and I deal with lots of people in recovery, but I'm going to say like I have a tremendous amount of gratitude for where I am today because I like to a certain extent there's some of the miraculous in here. And what I mean by that, we just described how challenging it can be. Wait a minute, you've lost all your coping mechanisms and your life's the worst it's ever been. Like the probability of success looks really low there, and it is. Someone who has the means, the financial means, like I did, fortunately, to go to a residential treatment facility, their odds, the success rate is about 10 or 15%. It only goes down from there. So the people that are struggling addiction and trying to get better, the chances of recovery are very, very slim. And it again, it's this isn't one of the things you just go into AA or you just go into NA or you just go here and you're going to be fine. No, even if you use those programs, even if you do residential treatment centers, it's probably less than 50% after 10 years. So I consider myself so fortunate and lucky that I was able to adopt this program and find this life of recovery. And as you said, there's no shortcuts. It's going and living through the pain of all of this stuff, feeling the pain, experiencing the pain, and not finding a mechanism by which to distract myself. And I learned that early on in recovery as I said, okay, I've removed these substances. And next thing I know, I'm moving into shopping or I'm binge watching. And I realize it's all got to go because it's all just another dopamine replacement. I've just got to experience and sit with this pain as long as it takes.
So I have a question that I think might put you on the spot a bit. So if it's too much, you can let me know and we'll shift gears a little. But when you say you lost everything, you really mean everything, and or everything that mattered to you as it relates to your kids and your wife and your life. And I I see you in the body that you live in today, in the energy that you create and everything that you do. And I don't see a man walking in shame of what he did. I imagine that that's actually something that's incredibly rare and probably the reason that you were able to get better. Shame and addiction are insidious. How did you manage to move from the depth of shame that you felt into living a life where you have forgiven yourself, even though you haven't been forgiven by the people?
Well, again, I'm only speaking to my own personal journey. I would describe the 12-step program as a shame processing machine. It's a very it's like a sausage grinder. It's not a painless process, and it requires a tremendous amount of work. But this process of I'm gonna trust a power greater than myself. I'm gonna clean house, and I'm gonna take responsibility for the things I did. I'm gonna go and apologize to anybody who's willing to hear my apology, and I'm going to take responsibility. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a commitment to not let these things come into my life. And when they do, I'm going to apologize right away, or I'm going to do something. And then I'm going to go into service. And through this process of doing all that, we find the ability to forgive ourselves and actually to love ourselves. And maybe someone like me who grew up in an alcoholic family with an alcoholic mother, or you're probably feeling this absence of love from a parent that's putting a substance before you, and that's the underlying root trauma that probably I'm carrying with me. I never learned how to love myself, and I was probably always doing all sorts of things to try to deal with that in a really, really unhealthy way. But the program itself ultimately, the outcome of it is unconditional love for yourself and others. And we talked about this in a previous episode in terms of groups, even the group of these fellowships as they are. You walk in there totally decimated and broken, and everybody's laughing and telling these crazy stories, but they love you and they'll do anything for you. You walk into a room, oh, I tear up, and there'll be 50 people you've never met before that will drop everything and to come and help you at a phone call or a moment's notice. They won't even think twice about it. They truly love you and will do anything for you. And you start experiencing that over and over again. And you just start to just develop a new way to love yourself and to love others. And it just becomes this beautiful experience to the point where I'm at the point where I'm a grateful alcoholic because I've been exposed to this way of life and this way of seeing the world. I don't know if that answers your question.
But I think what it doesn't answer is, in a perfect world, the alcoholic or addict recognizes that they have a problem, goes and gets help, and then is able to be reunited with their family. Right. And I don't know what the stats are on that. I know that it happens, and when it happens, it can be incredibly successful. But I also know that it often doesn't happen. And so, part of the question that I have is, that I'd like to ask of you is, for a family that's really struggling, what's available to them? Because to the addict, you have all of these fellowships. What does a family do to be able to enter into their own phase of working with their resentments and being able to move into healing?
Great question. And this is where I really hope to be of service to folks out there. But one of the things you said earlier, like you don't know the stats on it. Well, I don't know the exact stats, but I would say from the literature and from what I understand, the majority of families remain together if the addict recovers and the family also enters into a parallel type program of recovery or therapeutic that's related to addiction. In the majority of those cases, the family gets back together and they're actually stronger. And this is getting to your second question. Well, what's available for the families? There are things like, for instance, Al-Anon is available, and that's for, I don't know the exact acronym of it, but it's effectively for the families that have an alcoholic in it. This is a support group for those families. They also have a 12-step program. They also have all these aspects of it too that demonstrate what the family system involvement has, how it's been affected by the addict, and how the family unit itself may be perpetuating the addiction without knowing it, but certainly how it's having an impact on everyone in the family. Those fellowships can be extremely powerful.
So what I hear you saying on some level is that addiction is actually not just a problem of the person that's addicted, but actually it becomes a family systems issue.
Yeah, the addict, because you think of the addict as this little tornado and whirlwind, and that's what we are. That's so destructive, but the whole family gets enmeshed in it because it's a pernicious progressive disease. It doesn't start at a 10, it starts at a 1, it works its way slowly up to a 10, and the whole family gets worked to the 10 with it. The whole family's traumatized. The whole family's in need of healing. There's so much resentment, anger, and blame, and all this stuff, and it's warranted. It's not like it's not warranted, but if all of a sudden the addict just goes out and recovers and finds the sunlight of the spirit, as we joke, and comes back all happy, and that nothing's happened with the family, it's a disaster because the family hasn't had this opportunity that they deserve to work out their resentments and their angers and to let the addict take responsibility for the things they've done.
It's interesting too, as I'm listening to you, is that there's a place there where inevitably the family has gone through an experience that has also been hidden in large part. And in that hiding, there's a tremendous amount of shame. that this is my life, that this is my husband, that this is my wife, that it is whoever it is, this is my child.
Betrayal, the absolute betrayal the family must feel.
Totally. But it's not, but there's a level of shame there that when when met with a group of people who are also going through similar experiences, begins to lose some of its charge, and they realize they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones experiencing this kind of pain. Oh, wait a minute. This is actually what comes with addiction and opens the door for the potential for healing versus this continued hiding and shame, which grows when left in isolation.
Yeah, and the thing too, in particular with addiction, is I talked about earlier. There's so much um, commonality amongst addicts between the things they do. Like it's so you get two alcoholics telling their stories. Every single story is the same thing. Hiding the recycling, hiding alcohol around the house, like finding ways to drink more at parties, like the other risky behaviors and sort of like extracurricular addictive, that the way it branches out. It's almost like it's like an archetype. And that's one of the big reliefs we come in as an alcoholic or that you come to this fellowship thinking nobody's ever going to stand me. I've got so much shame. No one can believe the things I've done. And then after, like, oh, every single one of these people in the room have basically done the same things to a rougher extent as I have. They all felt the same way when they walked in. Gosh, I think we have a common disease here. And now I have people that understand me and can work it out. It's not me. I'm not a bad, terrible person. I had the disease that they had. It's the same for the family when they recognize, I didn't pick this bad husband, or my father is not this horrible person. Oh, he had a disease. And actually all the other people in this room with me also had a loved one that had a similar disease, and they all have the same stories, and they've all gone through something similar, not the same. And now we can collectively find healing in it. It's so powerful.
So, just so I'm clear, again, because I think it's a really important thing for our listeners to hear, when you say, I'm not a terrible person, I had a disease, is that you not taking responsibility for what's happened?
Not at all. No, and I think that's the main thing, is taking full responsibility for what happened. That's the key to it. But also recognizing, um, it's like this. It's also recognizing I'm responsible, but simultaneously understanding the powerless nature of the disease. I was powerless to see it at the time, but it doesn't mean I'm not responsible. It's a hard, I can sound very confusing the way I'm saying it. I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but both are true. Both are true.
I'm only asking because I see you in your recovery taking radical responsibility for everything. So I want to make sure the audience is not hearing that it's not my fault. I had a disease.
No.
Because there is a profound amount of personal responsibility that comes in there.
Yeah. And that's the only way through it, is personal responsibility, and then rigorous honesty. Coming out the other side of it to make sure it never happens again. I think there's a saying that, you know, we may not have understood our disease when we have it. Once we recognized it and got to the place we know what it is and know what recovery looks like, boy, we sure are, we sure can't use the disease excuse anymore. That's for sure. I know what it is, and I know the steps I have to take to stay healthy. And if I don't take them, that's a betrayal. Well, that's a betrayal to you. That's a betrayal to my family. That's a betrayal to everybody that supported me. So that's why I work so hard to make sure my life's a certain way every day, because I know now I have this disease that will cause absolute mayhem in the life of anybody I care about if I don't treat myself daily.
So, what does that look like? What does that daily work with yourself look like?
Well, before I answer that, I want to come back. I want to turn it back to you. You're married to a person in recovery. Um,
Sharing.
you'd mind sharing with your listeners what you see that as looking like, and how that maybe that relates to what your thoughts were in terms of where your life is going and who you'd be with.
Well, I never imagined that I would be with somebody in recovery, um, ever. I actually think that I used to think about people that were in recovery, and I used to feel really sad about the idea that I'd never be able to have a glass of wine with my partner if they were in recovery. And somehow that was really important. Um, so what's my life like with somebody in recovery? Um, hmm, well, because of the way that you live your life, um, and how consciously you choose to live your life, you have inadvertently made me, indirectly, you've made me very conscious of any time I choose to use a substance or a behavior to escape feeling uncomfortable. So, you know, not an unusual scenario in our household. Once every few weeks will look something like, um, I'm not I'm not sober. I have a drink every once in a while. Um, but now I'm so conscious of when I choose to have a drink that I will make a large announcement of, I'm feeling really angry right now and I'm pouring myself a glass of wine. And so it's like I can't even just do it anymore unconsciously. I become conscious of it, which is, you know, both a blessing and sometimes kind of annoying because it would be nice just to be a little bit unconscious every once in a while. But I don't have the luxury of doing that living with you. And I am actually truly for that ultimately. Um, but, you know, I think living with you in recovery is, there's two things that really stand out. One is that no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, if you get a phone call that is urgent from one of your sponsees, you will step out and show up. You will get out of bed. You will step away from the meal. You will do whatever is required in order to be the person that you spoke about when you showed up in those rooms that would do anything for you that moved you to that level. You are that person for many. I watch it. And it goes totally counter to what any system of psychotherapy or anything tells you about boundaries and the lines that you have to draw between yourself and your clients. There is no line from the standpoint that you are walking with constantly because you are one of, you're not separate from. And that has, you know, in many ways, I felt like that with my clients. And in watching you and in watching the groups that you are a part of, you've given me permission to move even more deeply into that way of operating. I think the other thing that stands out profoundly to me is in committing to your own practices, which include owning when you've done something that's out of integrity and speaking to it quickly, whether it be with me, with one of the kids, with a friend, whatever. There is such a high level of integrity with which you approach life. And alongside that, there is this profound level of joy that I experience with you. And the joy is one where emotionality, in a lot of ways, is absent. And what I mean by that is reactivity is absent. The highs and lows are kind of absent. But there is this joyful, and I say joyful presence that I've never experienced with anybody. And so in actuality, all that you've been through, what it's creating is an environment that is so much fuller than anyone that I've ever lived in. And while I used to be the clinical counselor working with those struggling with addiction, in many ways, your addiction and experience through recovery has become my teacher in how to live a very full and honest life.
That was
Yeah.
beautiful.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's the right question. And like, yeah, wow. Um, and did you when you've been working with the clients you've been working in addiction all the time, did you see the full outcome of recovery as a possibility? Is that something you held space for? Is that that's where it leads?
Absolutely, I held it as a possibility. But I don't think, as a counselor working in addiction who had never experienced addiction herself, could I possibly have imagined the world that could open up for that addicted individual um, in the way that I have watched it open up.
Mm.
And so now I would probably be better suited to be working with addiction. And I choose I choose to direct people who come to me that are struggling with addiction to other people who have recovered, because I think they're much better equipped to understand, which is hindsight's 2020.
Well, right. And again, it's probably quite a. I mean, that's probably true with all mental health issues. If someone's come through it, they understand it better. I just think the area of addiction, alcoholism, there's more of those people. And the thing I really have to acknowledge you, because the key ingredient for you to experience me and for me to be able to grow the way I've been able to grow in relationship is the open mind, the open heart, and the willingness to watch someone in this process see what their potential could be without holding judgment and shame and all of these other things that often show up when we're dealing with someone who's coming out of addiction. Is like the preconceived notion of what that might look like. You dropped all those things from day one.
I also didn't experience you
Mm-hmm.
in addiction. So what I got to experience of you was you having come through that. It might have been different. I have no idea. If I had known you.
Absolutely. It's interesting just on that because it reminded me of it. I have one data point of someone's experienced both, and that's my father. And it's really interesting. It's my father is married to an alcoholic wife for a number of years until she passed. My mom passed 20 years ago, and so he'd had full experience living with addiction. And then I went through my own stuff, and I think he was the one that came and got me to jail. He took me to my treatment center. He called me every day. He was there for me. But I still remember when this place I went to had a family day. Every Saturday was family day. The families would come and they'd sit with it. They do a seminar. And I remember his look in his face after day one seminar, 1.5 hour. He's looked at me, Chris, I had no idea that was what was going on in your mind. I had no idea this was a disease. And it just shifted his entire perspective of everything in an hour and a half. And he kept coming to them after that. And he became my greatest supporter, my greatest ally, my greatest cheerleader all the way through. And he experienced all this. And it took his openness and willingness to come to that one session and hear what these other people had to say. And it changed everything with our relationship and how we saw the process. And I just, I'm going to end with that. For you asked this question about what would I say to the families, and I think the main thing is don't try to solve this on your own. You can't understand addiction if you're not an addict. There's lots of support groups that'll help get you the information and understanding and support you as you deal with the addict in your family, who may not be able to get better until he hits that bottom. And what he may need more from anything, and get this from a fellowship, get this from a support, is help getting to his bottom a lot quicker. He may need to be pushed out of the house. He may need to have, or she, the kids taken away. These things may need to happen to that person to find that willingness and that desperation to change. But then once that change starts to happen, once they commit, show up for them and love them. And you'll also experience the joy of what recovery can bring to a family. And it's incredible.
Well, with that, I think our time is up, but it sounds like perhaps we have another podcast to continue this conversation, because it feels like it's only just getting started.
You've been listening to me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, on Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living.
Tune in every second and fourth Monday at 3 p.m. on Transformation Talk Radio for more real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and the masculine, you will learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow, and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
For more information or to connect with us personally, visit theway-healing.com. That's theway-healing.com.